everyone. Welcome to the video.
So, couple things I need to get out of the way before I go into the main topic of the video. One, I will largely not be talking about the currently unavailable unedited cut of season 12. I will only really be mentioning it every now and then to fill in certain gaps. Like, for example, obviously, episode 2 is completely untouched, and the unedited version of episode 3 was at one point available on Netflix. So I will be touching that. But other than those two episodes, I will mainly be talking about the edits that we got in the final version of season 12. Basically, we're going to be going over what official storyline Sherry ended up with the recut. Not the edit she would have had, but rather the edit she ended up getting. I figured I'd try something like this, mainly because one, and two, not really, hardly anybody is talking about the edit she ended up getting. And I actually find the edit she ended up getting to be very fascinating because as much as I tried to censor ever living hell out of her off of the show, she ended up getting multiple storylines, even in the final cut of the show. And those mainly because without them, the season would be, not as interesting. So the fact that they even chose to include said storylines at all, I find interesting. So I'm going to break down the storyline that she got in episode 2 and episode 3. That's where we're going to start. Because these are currently the only two episodes that have the uncut confessionals of Sherry Pie. I've always said this before I continue. No, I do not condone the actions of Sherry Pie, and I think she got rightfully disqualified for what she did, but this is a for fun video. Pretty much saying, rather than talking about the storyline she would have gotten, talk about the storyline she did get. So, let's begin. Episode 2, while it does heavily feature Sherry, I wouldn't really say it sets up any major storylines, not that I'm aware. Especially not any storylines that were really at all continued. Granted, I don't know the rest of the season, but like I said, based on what was shown in the final edit, any storyline she had wasn't really continued at all in episode 2. Episode 2, her and Jada were the top two of the episode, and they were clearly set up to be rivals in this episode, at least. Sherry being the old school campy queen, and Jada being the pretty pageant queen. We see this storyline from time to time on the show, and sometimes it's done well, sometimes it's not. From what was shown in this edit, it pretty much just showed her and Jada butting heads, which it's fine. It happens. Not really a lot to talk about. But there is one thing that does happen in this episode that does continue in the very next episode. Sorry, not the next episode, in episode 4. And I want to very briefly mention the moment of Sherry Pie having that mirror moment, the only mirror moment she gets on the season at all, where she is, talking to Rock'em Sakura, and they share their experiences and all that stuff. This does come back at least one more time in the final edit, but we'll get to that when we get to episode 4. Now, episode 3, this one is an interesting episode. So, right out of the gate, again, I will mainly be talking about the version we got over here rather than the version we got overseas, but I will be talking interchangeably about both because both will give context in certain areas. So in episode 3, we see in the uncut version that the Britta and Aiden drama, Sherry Pie was a lot more involved than what was shown in the final edit. We see in the uncut version of the episode, she is not only the one that instigates the drama, but she is also the one that directly adds more fuel to the fire with it. She is the one that encourages Britta to act the way she does, and she is the one that encourages Britta to continue to do the things that she did to Aiden on the season. So we can see that a little bit in the final version, but the uncut version makes it a lot more clear. There is one other storyline that is also set up in this episode in both versions. In both versions of the episode, Widow Von'Du and Jada Essence Hall are asked to say who is their biggest competition and who is their weakest competition. And Widow says that Sherry is her biggest competition. Keep this in mind. This will come up later in the season. And this is the most notable storyline that Sherry has on the season. So we could see right out of the gate, Sherry Pie has already caused 2 storylines, even in the final cut of the show. For example, the screen time with Britta and Aiden was caused directly by Sherry. And it's even noticeable somewhat in the final edit. She's the cause of it. She's the start of it. So we could get right out of the gate from what little screen time we can gather off of her. We can gather right out of the gate that Sherry is a very sassy individual, she's a diva. She's a very big diva. And if she feels you're not pulling your weight, she's going to call that out. That becomes very apparent with her interactions with Aiden. I mean, for example, there is a confessional where she literally says this about Aiden. She says, Britta and I are both very strong competitors. I'm just not so sure about the leader of the group. She is directly referencing Aiden, which even if this isn't shown in the American release, there are shades of it still visible. Such as Sherry correcting Aiden on the steps, correcting her on what to do in the challenge. That stuff is all still visible in the final edit. In the very next episode, we have the ball. And the ball challenge, well, it opens up after Sherry's first win in the season, where you see her and Aiden talking to each other, and Aiden saying, you should listen to my ideas more often because you got the win. This is shown to continue that storyline with Britta and Aiden, because very likely, should the uncut version of episode 4 ever be publicly available, I would not be surprised at all if Sherry in the confessional is rolling her eyes at him. So we can put a pinpoint in that. In this episode, there is a segment where Rock'em Sakura is, talking to everybody in the room, trying to make everyone happy, says, what do we want? And when she asks for someone to scream back, the only person to scream back is Sherry. which would very likely indicate that she had a very close relationship with Rock during the short time that Rock was there, and we can kind of see shades of it through where they're standing next to each other, how they interact with each other, the very few times Sherry's allowed screen time. We can kind of see shades of it. Other than that, there's really not much to note in this particular episode because, like I said, as far as screen time goes for Sherry here, the only thing worth noting is her friendship with Jackie is very apparent, even in the final edit. Jackie, in the final edit, is shown to be her right-hand man. Whenever Sherry is shown to be going against somebody, Jackie is right alongside her saying, yeah, you're right, Sherry. This person's wrong. This person's bad. All that stuff. She would usually be lighting the fire, encouraging Sherry to be shadier, encouraging her to be meaner. At least, again, that's what it looked like in the final edit. I don't know if that's actually what it was in the uncut version, but that became very apparent in this particular untucked. No, Sherry wasn't shady in this untucked, but it becomes apparent of how close her and Jackie are. Keep a pinpoint in that one. Now, episode 5. This one kicks off, I would say, the real start to the Sherry versus Widow storyline that we did end up getting in the final edit of the show. We did end up getting this in the final edit of the show. Started in episode 3 when Widow said Sherry was her biggest competition. Then we see Widow and Sherry bickering in this episode, the Grey's Anatomy episode. We see that where they are bickering over who gets the part of the mother. We see Widow very visibly angry, and Sherry, from what we see of her interactions with it, we see she's very unbothered by it. Widow is portrayed to be bitter. Widow is portrayed to be angry. Widow literally says in the confessional that was shown in the final cut, we see right out of the gate, Widow literally says, Sherry motherfucking pie. Showing that there was at least some beef between them that either was not shown or didn't really start up until here. Again, it's hard to tell where it would have started because, again, we don't see everything. We don't see everything that is shown, especially with how much they cut Sherry out of the season. But this is where the Sherry versus Widow storyline starts, or at least is the most apparent in the final edit. Sherry and Widow have what appears to be a notable rivalry in this season, and very likely it was highly, I guarantee, should the uncut version of the season ever release or see the light of day, I guarantee you there would be a lot more confessionals between the two. There'd be a lot more confessionals between the two. There'd be a lot more. Sorry about that. But that would be the starting point where I guarantee there probably was a heavy amount of confessionals from both Sherry and Widow in this episode that obviously wasn't shown. And we can see right out of the gate that there's a heavy emphasis on the beef, even in the final edit. We see Widow getting bitter at the start of the episode. We see her getting an angry confessional when it's Sherry's turn to rehearse in the challenge. And we even see her not looking that happy that Sherry wins the challenge in the Grey's Anatomy challenge. We can see it. Now, the storyline, shockingly, does not stop there. The very next episode, being Snatch Game, the storyline... Oh, wait, hold on. Before we get to Snatch Game, we have to talk about the Untucked. Because this is one of the rare instances where Sherry gets a bigger storyline. In the Untucked, she gets quite a lot of screen time and even starts a unique game where anytime something shady is said in the Untucked, she said we should hit this big red shade button. That is something Sherry started. That is something Sherry started and Jan continued with throughout the whole season. It becomes clear through some shots that Sherry and Jan had a very close relationship, and likely a lot of Jan's screen time was cut. And the other thing here is the Britta and Aiden drama comes right back. We see, from what little we get to see of Sherry in that Untucked, remember what Aiden said. She did not say Britta threw me under the bus. She said Sherry and Britta, both names, which likely gives away that Sherry also partook in parts of it, and some of it is even visible in the final edit. But the final edit also shows her being merciful to Aiden, allowing her to speak when she's venting and frustrating in the Untucked, where she says, let her finish, let her finish. And that's really all we get out of this Untucked from Sherry. But wait till the next episode. So the next episode is Snatch Game. And in Snatch Game, not much of note really happens in the episode itself, but the Untucked is where we get more Sherry screen time. We see in the Untucked a very perfect example of what I had mentioned earlier about Jackie taking part. If Sherry chooses to call somebody out, Jackie's right there with her. If Sherry chooses to say something bad about a queen's performance, Jackie is there right with her. For example, when it came to the Untucked and they were talking about each other's individual performances in Snatch Game, we see Sherry once again having an argument with Widow. We see her bickering with Widow. We see her continuing to get angry towards Widow. We basically see a continuation of the Widow versus Sherry storyline. We see Sherry calling out Widow for her not so great performance in Snatch Game. We see Jackie agreeing with Sherry right along with her. And even after Sherry walks away from the argument, Jackie continues the argument. She continues to light up because she is Sherry's BFF. She is Sherry's right-hand man. She is her second in command, so to speak. Like she'll go and continue going as if Sherry is a mob boss. And this continues even in the next episode. Oh, we're going to break down the next episode because the storyline don't end there. And I'm honestly surprised nobody noticed it. The storyline between Sherry and Widow continues at the start of the episode, which is the Madonna Rusical. The Madonna Rusical, we see right out of the gate, Sherry continues with Widow Von Du saying how she felt about being called out in the Untucked, and we see Sherry we see Sherry and Jackie both apologizing to Widow, and Widow pretty much not taking the apology and saying, y'all are both lying. You know, the Apollo lie confessional. We see it happen there. So we can already see what kind of storyline they were trying to give for Sherry and Widow. It was the literal battle of the big girls. And we can see that even in the final cut of the edit, which is the most apparent. Now, one key thing to note about Snatch Game before we continue is we also see the start of one more edit Sherry gets. And that is the judges pointing out that she looks like an old lady every week. That all she gives is an old lady, which is partially true, but it could also be partly her makeup too, and the way her face looks. It depends on how you look at the situation. But that would be the start of another storyline there. Now, in the Madonna Rusical, there's really not a lot that happens beyond the start of the episode. It's the Untucked I want to talk about. This particular Untucked is the only other instance in the entire season where Sherry gets another confessional. And I'm honestly surprised they left this in. If you recall, in the Madonna Rusical, Sherry, Jada, and Widow were deemed safe and they were allowed to go backstage. This left the producers no choice but to show quite a lot of Sherry in this episode, and it's very eye-opening and even very apparent that there was indeed meant to be a Sherry versus Widow storyline. We see Sherry trying to explain to Widow what her point of view was from the situation, how she meant it, pretty much her saying, you're taking this too personally, Widow retaliating back, Jada backing her up, which would reignite a continuation of the Sherry versus Jada situation. This is not the only other time Jada and Sherry butted heads. They also slightly butted heads in that Untucked where Aiden was popping off on everybody, where she directly said, I got interrupted. And we see it again here where she's actually agreeing with Widow and calling out Sherry as she rightfully should. So we see a partial resolution here, but again, not a finished storyline with Widow and Sherry. We still got one more episode to go. And that would be the last little bit of Sherry versus Widow that we got in the final edit would be the very next episode. I think it was the next episode. No, it was the next episode. So the very next episode, we see a continuation of it when RuPaul finally asks the question the second time in a row in the season, and that is, who should go home and why? This is the Gothic Wedding Challenge. Everybody, including Sherry, says Widow. Sherry is most important to note when saying Widow, when referring to this storyline, because she is the only one who said Widow that did not give an explanation why she said Widow. She just said Widow and moved on, which very likely indicated they were not on good terms. They were not getting along with each other. So the storyline with Sherry and Widow continues in one more episode, which is after Jan's elimination. After Jan was sent home by Widow Von Du, Sherry and Sherry and Widow had one more confrontation in the season, and that was the very start of the episode where Sherry points out that Widow was in the bottom. Widow responds, "So were you." Sherry responds for the first time. Widow says, "Same here." Sherry responds, "But you've been flatlining." This indicates that this scene probably was a lot more amped up in the original cut, very likely had a whole lot more confessionals between the two. And it becomes very apparent from the get-go that Sherry and Widow definitely had a lot of beef during the season, or at least just didn't get along, which happens. You're not going to get along with everybody you work with. Especially now, especially all the stuff that came out about her now. I don't blame her for not associating with her. But yeah, that would be the last time we would see on screen Sherry having any sort of storyline with Widow. Because, well, Widow goes home this episode. Now, Sherry's storyline going forward here, there's really not much else to say. She gets a few bits more of extra screen time with Janet the Planet, made her over. We get to learn more about how Janet got invested in that stuff. We don't really get to know much there. So there's not really much to speak of here. But I do want to lightly touch on the Untucked in Widow's elimination episode. And there is a line that Sherry says, which really indicates to me just how close her and Jackie were on the season. Sherry is the only one that literally not only compliments Jackie's outfit, but tells her, "You are going to be opening doors for LGBT Muslim people. You are opening doors for these people." She's praising her. She's uplifting her. She's saying it's good that she's doing this. We see that in this edit. We see it very front and center that is what she was like on this edit. That her and Jackie were BFFs. Her and Jackie were partners in crime. Again, anytime Sherry would start something, Jackie would be right alongside encouraging it. And vice versa. So, again, there's not really much to note as of the makeover episode. So we're going to get to probably the biggest moment in the season that you really can't avoid talking about. And that is the roasting challenge, where Sherry was not the second to last to go, and she went over the time limit of what she was supposed to do during her roast, which reignites the Sherry versus Jada storyline right here. We see it at the start of the episode where Sherry is saying how she doesn't want to go last, doesn't want to close the show, doesn't want to do this. We see Jada fighting not to go last. We see it continue for a while. And then we see a resolution where Jada just agrees to go last. And we see Sherry in the edit, very likely because she realized how she came across. We see her becoming very apologetic towards Jada. We see her apologizing to Jada multiple times on stage and in the Untucked. We can see her and Jada. We can see Jada forgiving Sherry, and we see Sherry, just trying to apologize and try to fix any beef that her and Jada could have possibly had. We see that in the final edit. Beyond that, the only other thing to point out is the puppets and Sherry's puppet segment when she is playing as the Heidi puppet. We only get one brief interaction from it and a confessional from Heidi saying that puppet is not soft and supple, which it wasn't. It wasn't. Now, one thing that is very eye-opening is Jackie, when she was doing Sherry's puppet, she mentioned the phrase chewing through the scenery, which could vary. She mentioned chewing through the scenery and forgetting multiple queens' names, which could be an indicator of how Sherry actually was working with her, or it could just be her doing a gag over her drag character. It's unknown because we don't get any context to any of the stuff that was said about her. The only other main thing we get from Sherry is just the judges being amazed that she's 27 years old and knows all these old references and all that stuff. And just mainly that. That's really the only storyline we get with Sherry this season. It's not a major storyline, but we can gather what they tried to do. Obviously, the main goal was to make sure you don't see her, that you don't remember her, that you don't pay attention to her. But at the same time, it's also kind of hard not to notice her when she's coming down the runways, when she has her Widow versus Sherry storyline, which becomes very noticeable in the final edit, when we see that she struggles with versatility at the start of the season because we see Michelle mention right out of the gate that she struggles to break out of playing the old lady. She struggles with breaking away from playing the kooky, wacky, older lady character. And we see that called out multiple times on the season. And we see from the get-go, we can see, even in the final cut, we can see how much the judges were praising Sherry. Because even in the episode where she realistically should have at least been in the bottom, she wasn't. She was not in the bottom for the roast. And the main critiques were they liked her outfit, they heavily praised her makeup, and they heavily praised the actual set. They said that she had the funniest set of the night, but the problem was she went overboard, which is likely what kept her out of the bottom that week. And really, there's not much else to reference with Sherry on the season because, again, that's all we get. And it's understandable why that's all we get from her in the season because they want to keep her presence to a minimum on the season. And that becomes clear from the get-go that they want to keep her presence to a complete minimum. Understandable. But it is always fun to see what story she did officially end up with, and she did. She ended up with the storyline of I Can't Stop Being an Old Lady, battle the big girls with her and Widow, and the classic clash of styles with her being the big, clownish, campy queen against the prestigious, beautiful, polished pageant queen like Jada. And we see that very clearly in the final edit. And we even see in the edit that she was very close with Rock'em Sakura. We see multiple times of her being very close to Crystal. We see multiple times her being close with Jackie. That's what stands out the most because Jackie is always sitting next to her, always talking to her, always doing everything with her. And we see that. We see that in the final edit. So what are we left with? I would say the storyline itself is an intriguing storyline. It's not boring. It's not bad. It's exactly what you would expect. Could it have been better? Of course, but we don't want it to be better because of what she did. So that is the storyline she ended up with. If I forgot any major standout moments, you can positively correct me in the chat. If you don't like that I did this video, that's fine. You don't have to like it. I don't expect anybody to like what I put out. It's fine. You don't like it, you don't like it. Like what you like. But be civil in the comment section, because if you're mean, if you're rude, you're nasty, I'm just going to block you. I don't feed the trolls. This is Kenny Mitsu 877 signing out. Hope you had a good day. Bye.